Welcome, everyone. We continue our series entitled League of Women Voters Empowering You, a program designed by the League of Women Voters in partnership with Dayton Access Television to provide unbiased, nonpartisan information on issues that are relevant to our friends and neighbors throughout the greater Dayton area. My name is David Bodery. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters and your host for this program as we discuss our topic, Navigating the News, Responsible News Consumption Through Media Literacy. Our guest this evening is Mandy Shannon, Head of Instruction and Research Services at Wright State University. She has a bachelor's degree in political science from Eastern Michigan University, a master's degree in political science from The Ohio State University, and a master's of library science from Clarion University. And I understand, Mandy, that you have a title, an interim title that you're using now.
I am Interim Associate University Librarian for Wright State University Libraries.
So you're a very busy person, and I just want to thank you for joining us tonight as we talk about media literacy. As the reference librarian, you're involved with coordination of library instruction and assessment in 2016, and Head of Instruction and Research Services at Wright State University, and now, as you say, Interim Associate Library.
Right.
So, very busy. We live in a world overloaded with information, which can really make it difficult to sort through all the bits as we sort of find the meaningful parts of the information that we need to live our lives. So I've read some information from the RAND Corporation, and they're suggesting that we're in a phase of truth decay. And I want to say that again, truth, not tooth, truth decay. And so I'm wondering if you've heard about this and if you have any thoughts about where we are and how do we deal with this information overload.
I'm a bit familiar with the concept of truth decay from the RAND Corporation. There are 4 characteristics that they identify as hallmarks of a period of truth decay. And I think that if you look at those characteristics, you could make the case that we are indeed in such a period. So the first characteristic would be a divergence between the data and facts of the time with public perception or public opinion.
Okay.
And if you look at a variety of different issues, one example I think that's really interesting is the public perception about the safety of genetically modified food.
Okay.
So this came into kind of public consciousness in the early 2000s. And at that time, about 20% of Americans felt that it was unsafe to consume genetically modified food. Over the next 15 years, by 2015, there was a fairly clear consensus within the scientific community that in fact there were no adverse health reactions to eating genetically modified food. But by that point in 2015, as there was more public awareness of it, 60% of the American public felt that it was not safe to eat.
So what I hear you saying is that these terms that we use, genetic and modified, somehow suggest or imply to us that this is bad.
I think there's something that's maybe a little bit scary about it. It conjures maybe science fiction.
Yeah, my apple is not growing in ear though, right? So it's not really scary.
Right.
In fact, Honeycrisp apples, I suspect, are genetically modified, and yet I love them.
Right. And I think a lot of our foods that we eat are in fact genetically modified. Even hybrid foods and fruit are in some way. It doesn't mean that it has to be in a lab. But as awareness and the use of the phrase became more common, but the depth of knowledge that goes with it doesn't necessarily keep pace, you see that split between the scientific consensus and the public perception of it.
So that we have this difference of perceived understanding between what the public thinks of when they hear those words, genetically modified, and what the science or the scientific world would see as concerning or not.
Right.
Okay, so that's one of the platforms.
That is one of them. A second case is, to put it kind of in a simple term, a blurring between fact and opinion in the presentation of information and news. And I think we can certainly see that as our information delivery tends to be largely digital at this point. Traditionally I could look at the newspaper and say, here's the front page of the newspaper, this is news. I know what I'm getting here. I'm going to flip to the back of that section. Here's the op-ed page. this is opinion.
And I know what that's, I know distinctly it's labeled such, and it was
Yes.
clear to me.
Yes, and we've lost a lot of those distinctions. A lot of those literal labels are now gone, whether it's internet news through news platforms or social media, or even the 24-hour cable news networks. There's no longer that clear differentiation between news, fact, and opinion or argumentation.
Right. So I think about that as I think about the fairness doctrine and the way in which the Reagan administration, I believe, changed the fairness doctrine as it related to how we needed to apply fairness in our reporting of the news. Am I right about that?
That I'm not as familiar with, and
Okay.
I couldn't speak to that with any kind of confidence.
I'm pretty sure I'm right, and
I
so
trust you on
this
that.
change, well, and it was interesting because the change happened as the internet was beginning.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that the internet was going to open up the channels of information for us so that we wouldn't have to have one television or three television stations to only
Right.
provide us the news.
Right.
That now we were going to have all these many channels through which we could get our information.
And it certainly has done that, and I think there's a lot of good to the way it's done that. I think it's when we start talking about media literacy and information literacy, a lot of times we focus on some of the difficulties of that, but information has become more democratized
Sure.
than ever before, and voices that were previously marginalized or underrepresented have gotten platforms that they didn't have access to. The trade-off is that it's a lot harder
To know the
sift
difference.
through and to
Yeah.
find them.
So that second sort of element of truth decay is the blurring of lines between fact and opinions. Then there's a third.
The third one would be the volume of information, and this is incredibly easy to see that we are saturated with information. If you look at the first 100 days of the Trump administration,
Okay.
the Shorenstein Center did a study on those first 100 days of news coverage and found 3 times the amount of news coverage on that 100 days than any president prior to it.
Any president
Yes.
prior. So even presidents who were in office during an internet age.
Correct.
Wow.
So between 2012 with the second Obama administration and 2016 at the onset of the Trump administration, not a lot had changed in the information and environment structure, but the volume of information that we were
Okay.
getting had tripled at that time.
So we've blurred the lines, and now we've got this increased volume, and so we're overwhelmed, overloaded
Yeah.
with information.
Absolutely.
And then the declining trust.
The declining trust is the fourth hallmark of a period of truth decay. And you can certainly see evidence of that if you just look at popular culture, if you have conversations. I'm sure anecdotally we've all talked to people who've talked about not being sure where to turn to. If you want to look at some studies of it, Project Information Literacy, which is a really great national organization that focuses on the information literacy skills of young adults in particular, did a study on the way young adults interact with the news in 2018.
Okay.
And they found that over 30% of high school and college students no longer believed any information from a news source because of the prevalence of misinformation and disinformation. It had led them to distrust anything. Even for those who aren't quite as overtly cynical or distrustful, a Pew study found that over 90% of American adults are very confused about the state of news. And about 2/3 of them are really at that extreme level of confusion.
So that causes me to have some grave concern, because if young people don't trust any news source and adults are finding in large numbers that they're confused by the news sources, how do we participate actively in a democracy that relies on the shared understanding of what's going on in our communities?
I think that there are, I think that you're not alone in some of that grave concern. And one of the things that I think is incredibly important is to not let concern tip into cynicism.
Okay.
And it is something I will caution young people, older people, anybody I talk to. There's a danger to cynicism, which is that we become disengaged.
Right.
And engagement is really critical, whether it's at the individual level, how do we engage with the news, whether it's at the community level, how do we engage with our neighbors in our community, and also at the government level, how do we engage with our elected officials to make sure that we're keeping track of this. One thing that I think kind of helps give me a little bit of comfort is I would say this is not the first period of truth decay.
Okay.
And Jennifer Kavanaugh at the Rand Corporation, who does a lot of work on this concept, has actually identified 3 prior periods of truth decay. And there are some really interesting commonalities between them. So the first one would be the late 1890s to early 1900s.
Wow.
So the muckraker time, the yellow
right.
journalism. And in fact, if you, for something else I was doing a couple years ago, I was looking at the historical New York Times. The first use of the term fake news in the New York Times came in the 1890s. Huh. So this is a term that's been around for a very long time. The second period of time where we see this truth decay was the 1920s to 1930s. Kind of in the Great Depression.
Right.
And then the third time would be the late 1960s, early 1970s. So in all of these times, there was some distrust in government, there were some questions, but there was also something else common, and that was the advent of a new form of information delivery.
Oh, right.
So the muckrakers, mass production of newspapers was new. The 1920s and 30s, radio,
yeah.
And then the 60s
Television,
and 70s,
yeah.
the use of television.
And now the internet.
Yeah, and
all
so-
the forms of news, right?
Yes, and so I think in a lot of times there's the technology outpaces our own skills and tools to handle the technology, and then governmental and professional regulations and codes of ethics that haven't quite caught up yet with giving us a structure to operate well within that new media or news environment.
Right.
So that gives me a little bit of hope and comfort that we'll get there. It just maybe might take a little bit of time.
Well, I'm going to interject here the thing that I often say related to the League, and that is that democracy is not a spectator sport. It's not something that we can watch.
Correct.
It's something that we have to be actively involved in. And so I guess I look forward to that phase where maybe we can develop some of those regulations or those rules of engagement, if you will, or even come up with some strategies for how do we navigate the overload of information. Let's take a minute to think about, all right, so we're not getting our news from one television, Walter Cronkite, for instance, one
Right.
television personality, and we're not getting it necessarily from the newspaper. So where are people getting their news from?
So more than half of Americans at this point get their news at least occasionally in a digital platform.
Okay.
If you look at the Pew Research news portal, there are ways you can look at kind of what is the primary source of news. The predominant source of news for most people across demographic characteristics is a news website or app.
Okay.
And so they're going to NBC.com or AP.com. The second and third are very closely tied, and it's social media sources and then cable news networks.
Okay.
Network and local TV kind of trails behind that a bit, and then bringing up the rear are print and radio.
Right. Wow. So, I mean, it's really changed a lot when I think about, in my own lifetime, how drastically different that is than when I was a child and I could see the nightly news, right?
Right.
And it was, no matter which channel I chose, and I lived in Detroit, so a Windsor station was available, and yet the nightly news was pretty similar, Windsor side of the river or the Detroit, the US side. So, interesting. All these different choices then, do people understand the choice that they're making as they're choosing where they get their media from or their information from?
That is a really interesting question, and I think often the answer is probably no. And part of that is the information ecosystem we're operating in now is not always something where we're seeking out the news.
Okay.
As often as not, the news is seeking us out. There are algorithms that are designed to catch our attention that push news to us, whether it's an alert through our smartphones, whether it's what we find when we do internet searches, those results are not consistent, they're not standard, they are tailored to really to feed what the algorithms expect that we want to see. They're designed to capture our attention.
And we talked about this a little bit in my last program when we talked about some information. To some extent, they might even be responding to what they anticipate will upset me or get me to react, right? To respond by posting an angry tone to my next message or whatever.
Absolutely. There's a whole strand of research on the role of emotion in perpetuating misinformation and disinformation that really goes along with the speed that information goes out. It comes at us very quickly, and part of that is because the lifespan of those emotional responses are pretty short.
Right.
Fear and anger are particularly effective at triggering those emotional responses. Again, this is not a new technique. If you think about kind of our image of the newsboys on the corner in the 1900s, extra, and
Read
then
all
some,
about it.
and some really kind of
catchy.
Yes, a catchy headline to hook your attention and make you buy the paper. That's basically what these headlines on social media or news sites are now doing. Is they're saying extra, pay attention to me, click me.
Right.
So there's definitely an element to that. The difference is that this now pays attention to what you click and what does get your attention and feeds you more and more along that line.
And to the same extent, I guess, that it's learning us, we can learn that, right?
Yes.
And so we can recognize clickbait when we see it and say, oh yeah, but I've seen that source and it's misled me before. I'm not going to click that again.
If we step back and are very conscious of what we're doing and thoughtful about how we approach the news, there's actually studies that show that our ability to think through this is much more powerful than the algorithms. We have a tremendous amount of power
Right.
as we approach this information. It's just taking that time to step back and think through it and make those actions and make those choices.
So if I think about what you've told me is we're getting our information from these social media sources, it's being fed to us. I guess my librarian from the school, my grade school, was right that I need to seek my information from multiple sources.
Yes. Yep.
Right?
Your librarian was absolutely right. And there are actually two parts about that. The first is to seek it out and not just let it come to you.
Right.
The second is to look for multiple sources. And part of that is thinking about, are you looking for multiple sources that approach this from a different perspective?
Oh, okay.
So you mentioned, we don't just have the 3 nightly news with Walter Cronkite anymore. We have a seemingly endless array of options. And we don't broadcast anymore, we narrowcast.
Right.
And it's really easy to find those things that kind of that confirm what we already expect to see. There's a lot of biological research that shows the pain centers in our brain actually light up when we encounter information that's contrary to what we already believe, particularly when it's political values that we hold important.
So this confirmation bias, right? So I seek out the things that confirm what I want to believe, as opposed to I will accept more things that disconfirm those things that I prefer to believe.
Right.
Wow. So I'm avoiding my pain centers by choosing media sources that confirm my bias.
Yes.
And then I wonder why I don't have the full story.
Yes. And so I think that searching out multiple perspectives from authoritative sources, I don't want to get into both sidesism here,
Right.
but what does the Wall Street Journal say versus what does the New York Times or the Washington Post say? How are they reporting the same story differently, and what different stories are they reporting? Gives us a better sense of what's going on.
Absolutely. So, all right. Are there some other best practices, tools that my librarian friend can help me to maybe figure out how to make sense out of this overload of information?
Yeah, and there are a lot of tools out there which itself can become a bit of an overload. So I'm only going to talk about one today, and that is the SIFT method.
Okay.
That is one that was developed by Mike Caulfield. He is a librarian researcher at the University of Washington Center for an Informed Public. The SIFT method kind of applies very broadly. The first step is to stop.
Okay.
And it's because a lot of our traditional skills that we've been taught don't necessarily work. So textual analysis is the default that a lot of people go to when they're trying to evaluate information. I'll read it and see if I agree. It feeds right into
Confirmation
bias.
Yeah.
So stop and take a step back and kind of take a look at what kind of information are you encountering, who's putting it out there, and approach it thoughtfully. The second part of that SIFT method is investigate the source. So if you're not sure where this is coming from, take a minute and figure that out. Who put this information out? Every piece of information has an intended audience and an intended purpose. So who put this out, for whom, and why? If you're not sure, there's a trick that people use called reading laterally.
Okay.
See what other organizations say about this organization. What do people say about this author? Does it give you some sense that this is an organization or an author you can trust? The third step at the F is to follow the information and really kind of track it back. See if you can find multiple sources that confirm the same information, the same conclusions. And then the T is to trace back to the original source, or reading upstream.
Right.
So very often, especially in this digital news environment, we get a report from this person who shared what that person said, who shared what this story said, and it becomes a game of telephone.
Right. My cousin's friend said.
Yes, exactly. So instead of saying, your cousin's friend said the CDC said this, go to the CDC and see what they said. So trace it back upstream.
I had a friend who would send emails that were outlandish, and I thought, what in the world, right? And I'm not going to repeat any of them, but you can go to Snopes or you can go to factcheck.org and confirm some of these stories that somebody said, well, my friend's cousin was in Kentucky and this is what happened, and then you find out, that story's been circulating the internet since.
And some of them for years, and they just get repackaged and repurposed. But there are a lot of professional fact checkers who have done these things. So particularly when something seems very outrageous, it's a great time to see, has somebody already fact checked this? You can just pull the words that are the main idea of that claim, put it into your search engine and add the words fact check.
Okay.
And that's going to tell you, has somebody already done this?
I've never tried that. I've used Snopes.com, SNOPES.com, and I've seen and used factcheck.org. But you're saying just put the phrase in my search bar and then add the words fact check.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
I can do that.
Yep.
That's really cool. All right, so we've got just another minute or so left, maybe a couple. Anything else that you think we should pay attention to? You've talked about SIFT, so we've kind of got a sense of that. What else should we be thinking about?
I think when I think about media literacy and navigating the news for responsible citizenship and kind of our role in civic society, I encourage people to remember that we are not just consumers of information, we are all producers of information. Because with social media, there's always going to be somebody who looks to us as a trusted source. So hold yourself to account, hold yourself to standards that you would expect from others. Before you share information, take a step back, assess whether you're sharing it because it's creating an emotional response.
Good.
Have you really followed through on these claims? Have you put it in context to make sure that it's not just the package it was delivered in?
That's really helpful, and I appreciate that. Trusted sources become so critical, yet there seems to have been an effort to erode the trust in the media. One of the tools that I use at the college is a tool called Media Bias Chart. And it is kind of taken on many different iterations. And if you just search for Media Bias Chart, you may find something that's really helpful. Well, we're just about at the end, so I guess I have to say thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.
Really appreciate your suggestions and your taking time with us to understand how we can most effectively participate actively in our democracy, but also do it in a way that is confirming of truth, I suppose, instead of truth decay.
Right.
So I do appreciate that. I want to thank our guest, Mandy Shannon. She is Head of Instruction and Research Services at Wright State University, but we know that she's also the Interim Associate Library Director.
Interim Associate University Librarian. It's a very,
Man, it's
a
tough.
mouthful, yeah.
And so we look forward to her next role, but we certainly appreciate the time you spent with us today. The League of Women Voters encourages everyone to participate in every election. And if you have further questions about this or upcoming programs, you can contact the League by emailing league@lwvdayton.org or call our office at 937-228-4041. Thank you for sharing your time with us today. Thank you for helping us become better informed, actively engaged citizens. And thank all of you for watching tonight.